All right. Dr. William McCarthy is a faculty member at the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. He has devoted most of his 30-year career to using behavioral strategies to help people eat better, exercise more, and avoid tobacco use. Most of his research focus has been on low-income populations. Dr. McCarthy received the 1994 American Cancer Society Capitol Dome Award for his career of public service, the 1994 Health Fitness Leader Award from the LA County Board of Supervisors, and the 2013 American Cancer Society St. George Medal for his exemplary volunteer activities. He received his research training at Yale University, where he got his psychology Ph.D., and the University of Illinois, where he received his master's in psychology. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Dr. McCarthy.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. And I appreciate the invitation to address the members of the CSC Pasadena. So as you've heard, I'm a professor of public health at UCLA. I do research on how daily food choices affect risk of cancer recurrence in women who are at least 6 months beyond their diagnosis of breast cancer. I'll say more about my research shortly. Here's a picture of two people sharing traditional Asian foods. This is good not only for our cells, but our commensal gut microbes. Commensal microbes are microbes that through evolution are designed to help us if we feed them well. And a big problem is that we have been progressively starving them. And that has not been good either for our microbes or for us. So here's the prescription. I'm getting to the bottom line right from the start. If you can count to 6, you can provide an optimal quantity of substrate, that's food for the microbes, substrate to your commensal gut microbes. Using national nutrition data collected by the CDC, my colleagues and I determined that most Americans were consuming only 2 highly microbiota accessible foods per day, despite the fact that risk of obesity, heart disease, diabetes, stroke, and cancer all declined with increasing numbers of highly microbiota accessible foods up to 6. Beyond 6, the law of diminishing returns sets in, and we saw no additional health benefit to consuming 7, 8, or more microbiota accessible foods a day. Those 6 servings represent about 20% of your food choices, meaning that 80% of your usual dietary choices can remain as before, assuming that you have been adhering to the dietary guidelines for Americans. Got stuck there. My UCLA colleagues and I are currently enrolling eligible women into a diet and exercise randomized controlled trial for estrogen receptor positive breast cancer survivors who are less than 5 years out from their initial diagnosis and who are currently wanting to lose excess weight. We are comparing 2 healthy diet and exercise interventions to see how much they both reduce inflammation, a known risk factor for breast cancer recurrence. One healthy dietary pattern is the well-known diabetes prevention program featured at the top of this slide. And this has historically used restriction of daily calorie intake as the way to reduce excess body fat, which then reduces inflammation. The other healthy dietary pattern is a novel one that we call the highly microbe accessible food approach to improving metabolic function. If you can read the asterisk footnote in the left-hand corner, and I acknowledge it's pretty small, it says that HMAF is a highly microbiota accessible food, and here's the key part, unaccompanied by added saturated fat, sugar, salt, or emulsifiers like lecithin. It says and other plant foods. No, recording is back in progress. but it's also the limits that they place on red meat that explains why Western European countries bordering the Mediterranean area have life expectancies that are several years greater than US life expectancy. So their diet is quite a bit healthier than ours. But it's not just the Mediterranean diet. Researchers have focused mainly on the health benefits of adhering to the Mediterranean dietary pattern, but similar health benefits are associated with adhering to a range of traditional dietary patterns observed in Japan, China, Scandinavia, Iran, and Mexico. According to a recent review, these benefits include reductions in excess body fat, excess waistline, blood pressure, risk of diabetes, of heart disease, and of chronic elevated inflammation. So an anti-inflammatory diet may even enhance brain health and has been at least epidemiologically associated with reduction in risk of serious nervous system diseases such as Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and even depression. So there are admittedly other real-world challenges that may get in the way of our goal of pleasing our commensal gut microbes. So I make it sound like it's going to be hunky-dory when you make the shift to a more traditional dietary pattern, less processed. But there are some temporary discomforts that you might encounter. And the good news is that they are temporary and that in the long run, your quality of life will be happier. But one of the challenges is increased gas. When your body is consuming a lot more fiber, and what we're recommending is that you consume at least twice as much fiber as the average American is consuming, that's going to produce more gas. And that's a sign that the microbes are happy. And when the microbes are happy, you end up being happy or happier. But we recommend that you adopt the increased fiber gradually so that your body has time to get used to it. Otherwise, it can be a little unpleasant. Plus, friends have to accommodate your new food choices. And through negotiation, you can arrive at reasonable compromises. Usually their concerns can be addressed. Another challenge is the extra time required to try out new recipes, to do the washing and cutting of fresh produce that eating minimally processed fruits and vegetables typically entails. And for some families, the extra costs of purchasing specialty foods may require some compromise. Despite these challenges, as I said, I suspect that your quality of life will be enhanced. Not the least of which is lower risk of depression. So that's something to look forward to. An underappreciated barrier to expanding one's repertoire of diverse fiber-rich foods is food neophobia. So fear of the new. Most humans come into this world as babies with an automatic skepticism of unfamiliar plant foods known as food neophobia. That is why most children reject their first taste exposures to solid food. It typically takes many exposures, typically between 8 to 14 taste exposures to a new plant taste before a child or an adult finds an initially disliked unfamiliar food now acceptable to eat. We tested this on a YMCA cohort of summer camp middle school children, most of them African American. As depicted in the graphs shown here, these slide participants initially disliked the taste of jicama. But after we encouraged them to have a taste every day for 15 days. And at the end of those 15 days, their liking of jicama increased so much that some of them started fighting to have more jicama. They didn't want others to take away their jicama. So that was a nice illustration of the power of mere exposure to a new plant taste to overcome food neophobia. So just because you didn't like something before doesn't mean if you continue trying it that you'll continue to dislike it in the future. So as many of us know from personal experience, eating less of high sugar, high fat foods is key to losing excess body fat. But simply eating less of our Western way of eating without changing what caused the excess weight gain in the first place results in yo-yo dieting. So as soon as we revert to eating the way we did before our our weight loss, we start regaining the lost excess body fat. And looking at the historical data, it's pretty clear that our ancestors, my grandparents, for instance, were eating more food, more potatoes. They were eating twice as many potatoes as we were. And yet the proportion who were obese was less than 5%. Today, among US adults, the prevalence is 42%. So the epidemic of obesity has gotten much, much worse. And it's not because we're eating more than our grandparents did. We're not. But we are eating different kinds of foods. So these new weight loss recommendations that we're now making, eat more of certain kind of foods rather than less of all foods, is consistent with the experts are now saying is a good way of reducing cancer risk. So the American Institute for Cancer Research says that, for sure, limit your intake of sugar, fast food, meat, and alcohol. We've heard that before, but a relatively new recommendation, which is in this box here, it says limit, here it is. Eat a diet high in whole grains, vegetables, fruits, and beans. Americans really need to be eating more beans. And when minimally processed, these foods are rich in fiber and in omega-3 fatty acids. The omega-3 fatty acid content is important because those are the best fats for lowering inflammation. So the traditional Japanese dietary pattern is consistent with the American Institute of Cancer Research dietary recommendations. So, here's a traditional Japanese diet, and it's colorful, and it's full of different kind of plant foods. It's rich in fiber. This is really, close to ideal. And as you can see, the years of life lost to cancer on the average is significantly less in Japan than in China, and that's less than in Europe and less than in the US. However, when we look at American Japanese, third generation Japanese Americans, look at this graph. Now their risk of breast cancer, if it's a smidgen higher than anybody else. So what happened? It's not the genes. It's clearly something else, and I suspect it's the food. They've now migrated to a US dietary pattern, and this has done damage to their microbes, and that has led to more inflammation, which has led to more cancer risk. So a landmark paper by Robert Weinberg has identified systemic inflammation as one of the typical landmarks of cancer. So reducing elevated chronic inflammation seems to be an important ingredient to preventing cancer or cancer recurrence. So elevated systemic inflammation does not just increase cancer risk, it also increases risk of most of the chronic diseases that kill Americans, including heart disease, diabetes, fatty liver disease, and even Alzheimer's disease and stroke. In fact, many researchers view increasing inflammation as a hallmark of aging. But it need not necessarily accompany aging if we exercise plenty and if we eat more of Mother Nature's unprocessed foods. So now we know that one of the mechanisms by which food choices influence inflammation is by mediation by the commensal gut microbes. If we want to live longer lives free of cancer, we need to do a better job of feeding our commensal gut microbes well. So in the past half century, Americans have been doing the opposite. They've been progressively stripping out or chemically altering dietary fiber from common foods. Dietary fiber is the favorite food of our. So taking the fiber out, we human hosts don't mind, but our microbes mind terribly. And they've been taking it out on us by forcing us to eat more than we need to. So here we have two lists. The first one on the left lists the contributors to raising chronic inflammation. The second one on the right lists the contributors to reducing chronic inflammation. You already know the things you should be avoiding on the left. It's the list on the right that I would like you to concentrate on. If you want to live longer and avoid cancer, it helps to exercise regularly, eat a lot of fish, seeds, and soybeans, and double both the quantity and diversity of minimally processed fiber-rich foods, especially whole grains, fruits, vegetables, and beans. Also, getting regular sleep and engaging regularly in joyful activities also seems to be key. So there are many species on this earth that, strangely enough, feature a greater number of genes than humans have. When researchers finally sequenced the entire human genome, they were surprised to find that humans had only 20,000 protein encoding genes, about the same number of genes as found in the minuscule C. elegans worm. The reason why humans have been able to dominate the earth despite the limited pool of human genes is in part because humans made an evolutionary bargain with several thousand species of microbes. The bargain was that if humans provided protected environments in which the microbial species could thrive, they in turn would provide the thousands of additional genes needed for optimal human metabolic and immune system functioning. Collectively, the microbial species in the human gut microbiome has 2 million protein encoding genes compared to only 20,000 for humans. Collectively, they are at least 100 times smarter than humans when it comes to extracting nutrients from complex carbohydrate-rich foods, because they have at least 10 times as many glycoside hydrolases. These are carbohydrate-specific enzymes that humans have much less of, and that's why they're limited in what kind of carbohydrates they can digest. So most of the carbohydrates that humans consume are ultimately going to be fermented and digested, if you will, by the microbes, not by the human host. So early in the human lifespan, proteobacteria are dominant. And later, and for most of human lifespan, the dominant phyla for commensal bacteria are Bacteroidetes and Firmicutes. And the dominant phylum for potentially pathogenic bacteria are Proteobacteria. So we want less Proteobacteria in the human body. And so note that most species in the gut are obligate anaerobes. That is, they die in the presence of too much oxygen. So the commensal microbes that are most helpful to us do not like oxygen. They don't want to compete with their human hosts for oxygen. But their enemies, the proteobacteria, are aerotolerant, meaning that their competitors, their enemies, thrive in an oxygen-rich environment, whereas the obligate anaerobes die. So we have to do, we have to provide the kind of foods and the kind of environment that allow the obligate anaerobes to thrive. And it turns out that exercise is really key. But I'll get to that in a minute. So just note that the human body, especially the adult human body, is quite expert at screening out proteobacteria, such that there's only 4.5% of all the bacteria that make up proteobacteria in the human gut. But outside, they really dominate. They dominate the air, they dominate the ocean, and they're quite prevalent in the soil. So the only reason why it's so low in the human gut is because our stomach, our intestinal system does a really good job of screening out the pathogenic bacteria. And by the pathogenic bacteria, I mean, stuff like Serratia and E. coli. You've all heard of E. coli and Salmonella. That's another proteobacteria. And so here over the lifespan, here's a pictorial representation of the healthy adult with a minimal amount of proteobacteria, and then older folks who, because they're obese, because they have diabetes, or because they have cancer, have higher percentages of their bacteria being proteobacteria. So this is not a good sign. So we want to keep the proteobacteria to a minimal size. And we can do that through a combination of exercise and healthy eating. So cancer is associated with a weakened immune system, and it has a harder time keeping the proteobacteria in check. And that's partly why you have 14.9% for somebody with cancer, as opposed to 4.5% of proteobacteria in the healthy adult. So in healthy adults, as I said, more than 90% of the bacteria in our guts are good for us and want us to thrive because their lives depend on us. So 5% of the bacteria in our guts are typically pathogenic, but are kept in check by commensal bacteria. So you've probably heard of C. difficile, and it causes vomiting and kills some Americans every year. And C. difficile actually exists in many healthy guts, but it's kept in check by the good bacteria. So as long as the good bacteria are well fed, then they can keep in check, whatever pathogenic bacteria might be in our gut. So at the far left of this slide, under the big X, are all the health conditions that can be prevented by eating more minimally processed, high fiber foods and foods rich in omega-3 fatty acids. They include diseases of the liver, the kidney, and inflammatory bowel disease. They include stroke, immune diseases like asthma, obesity, colon cancer, and diabetes. They even include Alzheimer's. So by eating mostly fiber-poor, ultra-processed foods like those shown to the left here on this slide, Americans are not achieving the recommended quantity of daily fiber intake of 25 to 30 grams of fiber from food each day. They're getting like 14 grams. Food manufacturers often remove fiber in the course of food processing because consumers prefer the taste of refined carbohydrates, and because removing the fiber is typically associated with the longer shelf life before the food becomes stale, moldy, or rancid. So it isn't just the quantity that matters, it's also the diversity of fiber-rich food sources. The randomized controlled trial results shown on the right hand of this slide involved a comparison between two laboratory diets that had the same amount of fiber, but in the ultra-processed diet condition, the fiber was mostly from a single fiber supplement. In the unprocessed food condition, all of the fiber came from a variety of whole foods, especially fruits, vegetables, and beans. It should be noted that the participants in this trial were encouraged to eat until they were satisfied. There is no restriction on the quantity of food. And as you can see from, if I don't keep skipping here, as you can see from this graph, those who were eating the minimally processed diet ended up losing weight. And those on the highly processed diet were eating 500 calories more per day and not surprisingly gained weight. So here's an example of minimally processed foods. I can recognize where they came from. You don't need a nutrition facts label to understand what's in them. And here, these are mystery foods. They're all packaged. Goldfish, what is that? It's not fish. It's some ersatz food. So, everything else being equal, the greater number of ingredients comprising the ingredient list on your nutrition facts label, then the more processed the food is. So a popular example of an ultra processed food product is Hostess Twinkies. Do you want to guess how many named ingredients there is on Hostess Twinkies? Turns out to be 47. The ingredient list goes on forever. So this was the single supplemental fiber used in the ultra processed food condition in this NIH metabolic ward study that I was telling you about. And in order for the ultra processed food folks to get as much fiber as the folks in the the minimally processed food condition, they had to put 3 grams of this Nutrisource fiber in each of these glasses. So you got 12, and 12 is close to the 14 average for a whole day. So this is a lot of fiber, but it's a single source. And as you could see from the results, that single source didn't do that much good. So here's another example of a minimally processed, I guess, lunch or dinner. And the shrimp, could be viewed as either processed or minimally processed, but there's a lot more fiber of different sources in this lunch than in this one. And then the results, when you looked at the results, and these are the same individuals. This is what's called a crossover design trial, where the same individuals who did 14 days of being in an ultra processed diet, they then switched over to a minimally processed diet for the next 14 days. And so this is a comparison within the participants who were in this metabolic ward study. And so under the minimally processed food condition. They lost weight, they increased the satiety hormone. So that's a hunger dampening hormone. So they had less hunger, and they had less insulin resistance, which is a precursor to diabetes. So the risk of diabetes went down. The risk of heart disease went down because cholesterol went down, and the same thing for triglycerides. And the inflammation went down. So all these good things were not reflected in the ultra-processed condition. The one exception was that the triglycerides did get reduced a little bit, but not as much as in the minimally processed food condition. So favoring minimally processed foods really seems to yield a whole bunch of benefits. So back to the prescription that I provided at the beginning. So we include exercise here. You might say, well, why is that? You know, most of the focus is on having 1 or 2 fruits, 1 or 2 vegetables, 1 or 2 whole grains, 1 or 2 plant proteins. Why exercise? A part of the key to that is understanding what happens to oxygen in the body as a result of exercise. So at rest, the typical adult is consuming 5 liters of oxygen per minute. With moderate exercise, that's more than tripled to 17.5 liters per minute. But the body simply doesn't magnify how much oxygen is then spread to all the organs. It actually engages in triage. So notice that the digestive organs take the most oxygen when the body is at rest, but it's greatly reduced under conditions of exercise. So it goes from 1350 milliliters to just 600. So that's a 55% reduction of oxygen going to the intestinal system. And that's good for the obligate anaerobes, those commensal microbes that are good for us. They don't want oxygen. So this is exactly the kind of milieu, the kind of environment that will cause the microbes to thrive. And then when they thrive, we will thrive as well. And when they thrive, they produce increased short chain fatty acids like acetate, propionate, and butyrate. And all 3 of these short chain fatty acids do good things for us, but particularly butyrate. Butyrate is a very strong anti-tumor stimulant, and it's also very effective in reducing inflammation. It also does a good job of glucose control. And recently it's been shown through its influence on a satiety hormone called glucagon-like peptide to greatly influence weight control. So these results came from undergraduates who initially were sedentary, and then they were asked to exercise 3 times a week for 6 weeks, and without changing their diet. So there is no change in fiber intake, just a change in diet. But the reduced oxygen to the intestinal system caused the available fiber to be converted to higher levels of acetate, propionate, and butyrate. So it's really the case that exercise and food are inextricably inclined if you want to produce optimal health benefits. So just to give you a very concrete example of how you can get these microbe-friendly foods. Here are microbe-friendly foods that constitute minestrone. Minestrone is the archetypal Mediterranean food. Minestrone was invented in Italy. So here's a pound of white beans. Here's a pound of Great Northern beans. We use a cup of farro. We use low sodium broth, and we use whole tomatoes. And I'll get to why whole tomatoes rather than canned tomatoes. I have to confess, for efficiency, I often use canned tomatoes as well. But the result of this is that you get two veggies that I would call HMAFs. Those are the highly microbiota accessible foods. So 2 veggies are eligible, 1 fruit, that's the tomatoes. Botanically, these are fruits, even though we treat them as vegetables. 1 whole grain, so farro or whole wheat pasta, and then 2 plant proteins, so the white beans and then the Great Northern beans. So there's a great variety in this one dish. And look at that. When you add that up, that's 6, all in one dish. So the rest of your day is already, explained, or already, you can eat anything that's within the dietary guidelines for Americans, because now you know that the microbes are going to be plenty satisfied for the rest of the day. And this just illustrates the impact that beans have on the fiber intake. So fiber is the favorite fuel for the commensal microbes. If we want them to be happy, and we do, because when they're happy, they make us happy and healthy. Beans are a great contribution to what the microbes want. So if we can get Americans to eat more beans, that would be great. And then to cap things, I like to add additional vegetables, and then that increases the fiber intake even more. So that constitutes 44% of the daily recommended intake just in that one dish. So, and we talked about different oils and which ones are least likely to contribute to inflammation. And my choice, since it's highly available, is canola oil. And that's because the saturated fat intake is lower relative even to olive oil, and certainly compared with coconut oil and compared with corn oil or other vegetable oil. And so, as I said, fresh tomatoes are better than canned tomatoes. Why is that? Well, in looking at the ingredients, it says tomatoes, tomatoes, they're both tomatoes. So they should be perfectly equivalent, but they're not. And the reason why is because the whole tomato has skin and seeds. And in the course of processing the tomato paste, they take out the water and they take out 24% of the fiber attributable to the skin and to the seeds. And this is not good for the microbes, not only because of the fiber loss, but because, as I said earlier, there are other components called polyphenols, which are important antioxidants. They really help to reduce inflammation, and they tend to be in the skin of many fruits and vegetables. And so when you throw away the skin, you're not only throwing away the fiber, you're throwing away these very salutary polyphenols. So yeah, do not make the mistake of thinking, oh, tomato paste, since all it is tomatoes, must be the same thing as a raw tomato. It's not. It's a processed version of the tomato. And then finally, breakfast might be a great way to start the day with some microbe-friendly foods. And just to stack the deck, we can throw on some seeds on our oatmeal as well as the banana. And that greatly increases the number of microbe-friendly foods to 4. And so you only have 2 more for the rest of the day, and you've met your optimal level 6. So, but, there's so many choices of foods rich in fiber where you can have microbe-friendly foods. So you don't have to stick to the Mediterranean diet, the Mexican Mesoamerican diet, the pre-Columbian Mesoamerican diet in Mexico was very healthy, full of a diverse source of fiber-rich foods. The African heritage diet also had lots of vegetables rich in fiber. And the Asian diet, look at this proliferation of plant foods. So the Asian diet is such a good choice. So Americans have lots of choices, especially in a cosmopolitan city like Los Angeles or Pasadena. Both of those have all sorts of cuisines that are worth exploring, in part because they feature a lot more plant foods that we should be eating. When we look at what grains Americans eat, typically they limit themselves to like 4, maybe oats in the morning, and then the rest of the day it's whole wheat rice and corn, and that's it. But look at all these other choices that are available. And then the same thing with beans and seeds. There's so many more choices that Americans should be exploring. And if they replace their meat intake with bean intake and with whole grain intake, they will find that they're not spending as much more as that earlier study had suggested. Might be the cost of migrating to a healthier diet. So in sum, use my plates. This is the iconic distillation of the dietary guidelines. Look at the 4 quadrants and try to get a microbe-friendly choice from each of these quadrants. And to get to 6, obviously you need 2 from one of these, or from 2 of these quadrants. But if you can count to 6, and accompany that with huff and puff exercise, then you're going to optimize your health and your well-being. And, additionally, I don't have time for this, but it's good for the planet as well. It's not just good for your body. So I do want to, make a pitch for the study that I'm currently conducting. We are enrolling people. So if you know of folks who are eligible for our study, please send them our way. Here's my email address and my telephone number. So I thank you for any help you can give us. And I'm eager to hear your questions.
Well, thank you, first off, so much, Dr. McCarthy. This was packed full of information. I was able to preview the PowerPoint before Dr. McCarthy's presentation, so I knew it would be, and we so appreciate it. Really appreciated seeing food pyramids from around the world, because you're so right. There's an abundance of healthy foods around the world, not just within kind of that celebrated a Mediterranean diet. So really appreciated seeing that. I did get a couple of questions in the chat. I want to invite others to send their questions in the chat, or you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask a question out loud. I'll just go ahead and start off with one of the questions that I received, which was around canola oil. They heard that, you said that canola oil is lower in unsaturated fats. It has a high smoke point.
No, it's lower in saturated fats.
Lower in saturated fats, I'm sorry. And it has a higher smoke point. But they also believed that canola oil was more processed than other oils. So they just wanted to hear any of your thoughts, feedback around that piece.
Yes, I'm ambivalent about all oils for that reason, because all oils are by definition processed. So we're talking about the best choice from all processed oils. But yeah, if you can rely on olives instead of olive oil for your source of oil, that's so much better. There are chia seeds and sesame seeds. You can get sesame oil if you want, but sesame seeds are so much better. Why? Because you get not only the oil, but you get the antioxidant benefits of polyphenols and fiber in the seed that you don't get as much in the oil. So yeah, so that question is well motivated. I compliment the questioner, because indeed, where possible, we should prefer a non-processed version of the same thing.
Got another question in the chat, just asking generally about health benefits of fermented foods in Asian diet, such as kimchi and miso.
So fermented foods are very interesting. And so those are probiotics. So the fiber I've been talking about is known as a prebiotic. And the prebiotics are the favorite fuel for the microbes. The probiotics are microbes. And for products like yogurt has commensal bacteria that, when we ingest the microbes in the yogurt, they can populate our gut. And since they're commensal, since they're friendly microbes, the more lactobacillus bacteria that we get from the yogurt, the better off we are. So I'm less familiar with the nature of the bacteria in kimchi or other fermented foods. But one caution I have about kimchi in particular is the high sodium intake. So yes, the fermented part of kimchi is salutary, and as best as we can appreciate from the available data, kimchi is a healthy choice, but it does have a higher level of sodium than we recommend. So it's not an unalloyed source of benefit for our gut.
Thank you. This next question, I'm wondering if this, a lot of times our participants here with breast cancer hear that there is some caution around consuming soy, especially if they have an estrogen positive breast cancer diagnosis. Someone asked, is there a limit to intake of soybeans?
So there are different kinds of estrogens, and the kind of estrogen that is most conducive to breast cancer, namely estradiol, is the result of conversion of fat into estradiol. That's not the kind of estrogen that you find in soy foods. We find that the more soy foods that people consume, and I'm talking about cross-national comparisons, the lower the risk of breast cancer. So I showed you slides of Japanese Americans in Japan. I mean, people of Japanese heritage living in Japan versus living in the United States, and how the risk was so much higher for the Japanese living in the United States. And it isn't because the people of Japanese heritage in the United States are eating more soy. Quite the contrary. They're eating a lot less soy than their cousins who are still living in Japan. So eating more soy is generally protective against breast cancer. So the better way to keep down the estradiol levels is to get off the excess body fat, because the aromatase enzyme converts the excess fat into estradiol, and that is dangerous. But that's an issue that's independent of soy.
Evelyn, I saw you unmute yourself. I don't know if you had a question you wanted to ask out loud. That was Evelyn. Well, Evelyn, we'll revisit you if you want to unmute yourself later and ask your question. I did get another one in the chat. How can we, or should we, be testing proteobacteria in our gut?
Since these are relatively new findings, these have to be viewed as conjectural. So we need a lot more science before we can translate them into clinical thresholds. But through the American Gut, you can, for $99, it takes a few months, but just a Q-tip amount of feces, you send that in the mail to the American Gut folks at UC San Diego, and they will do an analysis of all of your bacteria. And you can examine all of the different species that they identify and figure out, and they break it down by phylum. So there's going to be a separate listing for the proteobacteria compared to Bacteroidetes or to Firmicutes. And then you can compare, because they tell you what the abundance is. You can compare the percent of proteobacteria compared to the percent of Firmicutes and compared to the percent of Bacteroidetes. And so that's one way to do it. But right now it's not clinically useful because it's not been tested clinically. This is what I've been reporting is what we're finding, just observationally, looking at folks across the age continuum and varying in disease status. So I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but for me as a scientist, it's very exciting. And there will come a time, I suspect, maybe 10 years from now, when there will be clinical thresholds, as to, what's a dangerous level of proteobacteria, and what steps should people be taking in order to bring down that level.
Annie, I saw that you unmuted yourself, so just want to invite you to ask a question if you have one. Maybe not. Annie, did you want to ask a question? Okay. Christine, I saw you unmute yourself. Do you want to ask a question?
Yes. First of all, thank you. It's very, very informative.
Great, thank you.
I wanted to ask about the role of dairy in just in what you're talking about. Like, I know you talked about the yogurt. Of course, I'm assuming we should eat non-fat yogurt, but what about other dairies like cheese, and because I don't want to say it's fermented, but it's like kind of like that kind of thing. So just wanted to know what your thoughts were.
Yeah, so cheese is a feature of the Mediterranean diet. So, I encourage people to explore these different traditional diets, even if components might seem a little bit pro-inflammatory. But the diet as a whole, whether you use feta cheese or mozzarella in the amounts that the Mediterranean folks typically use, the overall dietary pattern is very successful in reducing inflammation to a degree that the US dietary pattern does not. But specific to dairy foods, if we focused on dairy foods, many of the dairy foods have higher levels of saturated fat than are desirable. So we need to be, as you mentioned, non-fat, our sources are probably the best bet. So the non-fat yogurt, non-fat milk, and of course, cheese is going to have fat unless you go for the fake cheese, which I don't recommend because it's so. Yeah, I hope that's a satisfactory answer.
Yes, it is. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Someone else asked, does cancer therapy / treatment impact gut health?
Unquestionably. But, again, this is preliminary, but it's looking like when the diet and the exercise lifestyle create a better milieu, that chemotherapy, that cancer treatment is more effective. And there's a lot of excitement now about the microenvironment around the tumor. And the stronger your immune system is, then the more successful it is at keeping the tumor at bay. And the immune system is going to be strengthened to the extent that you have a anti-inflammatory lifestyle, like the kind that I've been talking about, either a Mediterranean lifestyle or a Mesoamerican lifestyle, or something that's much more microbe friendly than the current US dietary pattern. So again, this is, this is cutting edge. So we don't have determined prescriptions as to how to make chemotherapy work best. What's the best diet? But I think down the road, we're going to have increasing insight into how changing dietary choices may actually make the chemotherapy more effective, or other cancer treatment more effective.
Wonderful. Someone asked, does eating organic, non-GMO foods have a health benefit?
It certainly has an environmental benefit. And if you're an American, you're going to be eating a lot of foods that have GMOs and you don't know it, because our government allows the manufacturers to introduce GMO components without letting the consumer know. So you have to live in Europe in order to know whether a food has GMO or not. But at the present time, we just don't know, how helpful or dangerous GMOs are. But it's pretty clear that environmentally, if you're concerned about greenhouse gases, reducing meat intake and increasing, as is recommended with these traditional dietary patterns, replacing your protein sources with plant sources instead of red meat. That's definitely a good way to go for the planet as well as for your body. So you get a double whammy by making that shift.
Wonderful. Someone asked about red meat, and they just quite simply said, should we avoid red meat totally?
I don't know that you have to do it totally. Historically, traditional dietary patterns, I'm thinking of the Asian dietary pattern, the Chinese used to have amazingly low rates of heart disease. That's now changed because they've adopted so many Kentucky Fried Chickens and Pizza Huts. But historically, they had really, really low rates of heart disease. And that was in part because their diet was had all these plant foods and very little red meat. They had fish, at least in southern China, and they had chicken. They did have pork, so that's, I guess, a red meat, but they didn't have cows. And when we think about the Mesoamerican dietary pattern, pre-Columbus, before Columbus arrived in Mexico, there was no pork, there was no beef. The Mesoamerican diet had none of these red meats because those animals didn't exist in North America. It was not until Columbus brought them over that Mexicans started eating a lot of beef. And now today they're in bad shape because they have, second only to the US, very high rates of obesity and obesity related diseases. And a lot of it is because of all the pork and beef that they're eating. So, I tell people of Mexican heritage, go back to your great-great-great-grandparents, what they were eating, the Mesoamerican diet, full of beans and full of colorful vegetables, all those peppers. They have such a healthy heritage diet that they can choose from.
In the chat, I posted just an article on the blue zones, which are 5 areas of the world where people live the longest. And some of the similarities in those 5 blue zones are exactly what Dr. McCarthy was just speaking to. So I posted that in the chat for anybody interested. Someone asked about processed soy, such as tofu versus soybeans.
So as a replacement of cheese, tofu is called by many, a Chinese version of cheese. It has some of the texture of cheese. It certainly doesn't have the taste of cheese, but I love tofu. And I used to love cheese, but cheese is too high in saturated fat, too high in sodium. So I've now replaced it with tofu. And so as a replacement for cheese, there's no question, tofu is the way to go because it has healthier fats and it has fiber and it has less sodium than conventional cheese. But it is processed. So relative to edamame, edamame is minimally processed. So if it's choice between tofu and edamame, I think you're going to be even better off with edamame. But, relative to what most Americans are currently eating, I think tofu is an excellent choice.
Any other questions? I want to thank you so much, Dr. McCarthy, on behalf of all of us here. I think one thing I want to point everybody to in his presentation was also to engage in enjoyable activities, that increased longevity. And I know that, food is enjoyable for me too. So I think, what you've presented, Dr. McCarthy, is a way to take some control amidst this cancer experience, which is a completely out of control experience. We can control what we eat. And certainly I hope that everybody finds enjoyment in what they eat. I know it certainly brings me joy. So thank you so much, Dr. McCarthy. We'll give you a virtual round of applause. And with that, we'll bid you adieu. And for those of you who can stick around, I'm just going to launch a quick poll for you to share more of what you would like to see at CSCP.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel. And I thank the audience. I loved their questions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good night.
Good night.